Thomas Miller was 75 years old, a man whose presence was as steady and enduring as the oak trees lining his suburban garden. After 40 years as a lead investigator for the Metropolitan Police, Thomas had traded the chaotic adrenaline of the Major Crimes Unit for the rhythmic snip of pruning shears and the quiet scent of damp earth. To his neighbors, he was a peaceful widower enjoying his twilight years. But beneath the soft cardigans and the polite smiles, the detective's mind remained a sharp, restless machine, a tool designed to find the one piece that didn't fit. Every Sunday, the silence of Thomas's home was broken by the arrival of his only son, Julian. At 35, Julian was the picture of modern success. A high-flying investment banker with a penchant for tailored Navy suits and expensive watches, he never missed a weekend visit. He would bring premium coffee, ask about the rose bushes, and listen patiently to Thomas's stories of old cases. On the surface, it was a portrait of filial devotion that any father would envy. However, the detective's instinct in Thomas, a muscle that had hunted predators for 4 decades and never quite atrophied, began to twitch. It started with small, almost imperceptible anomalies. Thomas noticed that Julian's gaze often drifted toward the heavy, vintage safe tucked in the corner of the study, not with curiosity, but with a calculated, lingering intensity that lasted exactly a second too long. He noticed the way Julian's smile didn't quite reach his eyes when Thomas mentioned his improved health reports from the doctor. Most unsettling was Julian's sudden obsession with estate planning. "Dad, the world is getting unpredictable," Julian had said during their last dinner, sliding a thick stack of documents across the mahogany table. "I've arranged for a new series of life insurance policies. It's about protecting your legacy. I just need your signature here and here." Julian's tone was smooth, polished with the practiced warmth of a salesman, but Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft in the room. To a layman, it was a son looking out for his father's future. To a man who had interviewed hundreds of suspects, it was a predator setting a perimeter. Thomas looked at the papers, then at the man he had raised, the boy he had taught to ride a bike, and the student whose Ivy League tuition he had funded with decades of overtime pay. He saw the golden sun, but for the first time, he also saw a hidden shadow. Julian was no longer just a visitor. He was an observer, measuring the house, the safe, and perhaps the remaining days of Thomas's life. Thomas signed the papers with a steady hand, his face a mask of aging compliance. But as the door closed behind Julian that evening, Thomas didn't go to bed. He sat in his study, staring at the safe. The game had changed. He wasn't just a father anymore. He was a lead investigator once again, and the prime suspect was sitting at his own dinner table. The days following Julian's visit were heavy with a silence that Thomas Miller hadn't felt since the first year after his wife, Martha, passed away. Every time Thomas closed his eyes, he saw the calculated gleam in his son's eyes, a look that belonged in an interrogation room, not a family home. To clear his mind and regain some sense of the man he used to be, Thomas decided to tackle a task he had avoided for nearly a decade: clearing out Martha's old oak trunk in the attic. The attic was thick with the scent of cedar and aged paper. Thomas moved with the gingerly care of a man who knew that memories could be as sharp as glass. He spent hours sorting through vintage dresses, old theater programs, and faded photographs. He was nearly finished when his hand brushed against a false bottom at the very base of the trunk. With a practiced flick of his wrist, a skill from his days searching drug dens, he pried the board loose. Inside lay a single, sealed medical file, yellowed at the edges but remarkably preserved. It was dated 30 years ago, exactly 5 years before Julian was born. Thomas felt his heart still as he broke the seal. The file wasn't about a common illness. It was a confidential report from a fertility specialist Martha had visited in secret. Thomas adjusted his reading glasses, his breath hitching. The clinical language was cold and final. The report detailed a series of tests performed on Thomas during a routine checkup that he had long forgotten, under the guise of general blood work. The conclusion was written in bold, unequivocal letters: Thomas Miller was sterile, a permanent condition resulting from a childhood complication. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Thomas sat on the dusty floor, the silence of the attic suddenly suffocating. If he was sterile, then Julian, the boy he had held in the delivery room, the man he had raising as his own flesh and blood, was not his biological son. His detective's mind, always hungry for the truth, began to weave together 30 years of threads into a new, terrifying tapestry. He remembered the brief period of distance between him and Martha just before the pregnancy. He remembered the man she had worked for briefly, a charming but reckless hedge fund manager who had disappeared after a scandal. But most importantly, he thought about the current betrayal merging with the ghost of the past. Julian knows, Thomas whispered to the empty room. It was the only explanation for Julian's sudden transition from a devoted son to a cold strategist. If Julian had discovered this truth, perhaps through a DNA kit or by finding similar records, he wouldn't see Thomas as a father to be cared for. He would see him as a stranger who happened to be sitting on a fortune. To Julian, Thomas was an obstacle, a placeholder for wealth that rightfully belonged to the man who had actually funded the lifestyle. Thomas looked down at the file, then at his own trembling hands. He had spent his entire life protecting Julian, ensuring he had the best education, the best connections, and a safety net that Thomas himself never had. He had viewed Julian as his legacy, the one thing that would remain after his own heart stopped beating. Now, that legacy had evaporated like mist in a storm. The realization transformed Thomas. The grandfatherly cardigan no longer felt like comfort. It felt like a disguise. He wasn't just a father who had been lied to. He was a target in a long con. Julian's insistence on the new insurance policies and his interest in the study's safe were no longer signs of greed. They were the movements of a man who felt no biological or moral tether to the victim he was about to harvest. As the sun set, casting long, skeletal shadows across the attic floor, Thomas Miller stood up. His stiff joints protested, but his resolve was iron. The betrayal of the bloodline was a deep wound, but it had also provided him with something he hadn't had in years: absolute clarity. Julian thought he was dealing with an old man who had outlived his usefulness. He had no idea he was dealing with the most dangerous version of Thomas Miller, the one who had nothing left to lose and a lifetime of experience in dismantling the lives of those who thought they were above the law. Thomas carefully placed the medical file in his pocket and descended the stairs. He didn't go to the kitchen for his evening tea. He went straight to the study, sat at his desk, and picked up a specialized piece of equipment he hadn't touched in 15 years. The investigation had moved beyond suspicion. It was time to build a case. Thomas Miller did not confront Julian with the medical file. In his 40 years of service, he had learned that a premature confrontation only allowed a suspect to destroy evidence and refine their lies. Instead, Thomas reverted fully to his persona as a hunter, operating with the cold, clinical precision that had once made him the most feared investigator in the department. The cardigan and the pruning shears were set aside. Thomas spent Monday morning at a specialized electronics shop in the city, purchasing hardware that his younger self would have envied. By Monday evening, he had successfully bypassed the security of the laptop Julian frequently used during his weekend visits. He installed a sophisticated, undetectable keystroke logger and set up a remote mirroring protocol. Thomas sat in the dark of his study, the blue light of a separate monitor illuminating the deep lines on his face as he waited for the data to stream in. The revelation was not a gradual leak, but a tidal wave of chilling evidence. Julian, the golden son who bragged about his high-stakes acquisitions, was a hollow shell. The logs revealed that Julian was drowning in millions of dollars of gambling debt, owed to a ruthless offshore syndicate that operated out of Macau. The threatening emails from the syndicate were blunt. Julian had 30 days to settle the debt, or the asset would be liquidated. Thomas realized with a heavy heart that Julian viewed him as that asset. The estate planning and the new life insurance policies were not about legacy. They were Julian's exit strategy. But as Thomas scrolled deeper into the search history, the air in the room seemed to freeze. Julian wasn't just waiting for Thomas to die of natural causes. He was actively researching how to accelerate the inevitable. The browser history was a map of cold-blooded intent. Chilling searches for undetectable cardiac arrest induction, synthetic potassium overdose symptoms, and post-mortem insulin level detection filled the logs. Julian had even downloaded a detailed floor plan of Thomas's house, marking the blind spots of the old analog security cameras Thomas had never bothered to upgrade. To Julian, the man who had raised him, taught him to drive, and celebrated every milestone of his life was no longer a person. Thomas had been reduced to a simple, Cruel equation. Value equals asset, liability. The asset was the house and the seven-figure insurance payout. The liability was the time Thomas had left to draw breath. Thomas leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. The betrayal of the bloodline had been a wound to his heart, but this digital paper trail was an assault on his very existence. He thought about the boy he had loved, the boy who wasn't even his, and realized that Julian had likely known the truth for years. Julian had used that knowledge as a psychological shield, convincing himself that he owed Thomas nothing, not even the mercy of a natural death. The detective's instinct told Thomas that the insurance celebration dinner Julian had scheduled for the upcoming Saturday was the target date. Julian would bring the estate documents, a bottle of celebratory wine, and a vial of something silent and deadly. Thomas didn't call the police. He knew the syndicate was watching Julian, and Julian was desperate. Any overt move by the authorities might cause Julian to disappear or, worse, provoke the syndicate into taking more violent measures that could involve the innocent neighbors. No, this required a more tactical form of justice. Thomas opened a hidden file on his computer, a collection of contacts from his old life who still owed him favors. He began to draft a series of instructions. If Julian wanted to play a game of life and death, Thomas would ensure the rules were strictly enforced. The hunter was now ready. He spent the rest of the week tending his roses with an eerie, practiced calm, knowing that he was preparing a stage for a final performance. Julian thought he was walking into a house with a defenseless old man. He had no idea. He was stepping into a trap designed by a man who had spent a lifetime studying the darkness in the human soul. The ledger of the past was about to be settled, and Thomas Miller was going to make sure every debt was paid in full. Saturday evening arrived with a deceptive tranquility. A soft rain pattered against the study windows, casting a silver sheen over the garden Thomas had spent the week meticulously manicuring. Inside, the mahogany dining table was set with the finest porcelain and crystal, a silent stage for a play Julian thought he was directing. Thomas moved with a calculated, slow grace, wearing a deep navy cardigan that hid the thin, professional-grade microphone taped to his chest. Julian arrived at exactly 7 o'clock, carrying a vintage bottle of Bordeaux and a leather briefcase filled with the finalized insurance documents. He looked radiant, his navy suit impeccably tailored, his smile wide and warm. But as Thomas took his coat, he felt the younger man's hand tremble, a microscopic tremor that only a veteran investigator would catch. Julian wasn't just here to visit. He was vibrating with the desperate energy of a man on the edge of a precipice. "To a long life and a secured legacy, Dad," Julian said, his voice smooth as silk as he uncorked the wine in the kitchen. Thomas watched from the doorway, his eyes tracing Julian's every movement through the reflection in a polished silver tray. He saw Julian's back stiffen as he leaned over the counter. With a quick, practiced motion of his thumb, Julian popped the cap of a tiny glass vial hidden in his palm and dropped a clear, viscous liquid into Thomas's glass. It was a move Julian had likely rehearsed 100 times in the mirror, but to the eyes of a man who had dismantled drug cartels, it was as loud as a gunshot. Julian walked into the dining room, handing Thomas the tainted glass with a look of profound, artificial affection. "Drink up, Dad. This vintage is special. It's about celebrating what we've built together." Thomas raised the glass, the deep red liquid shimmering under the chandelier. He could almost smell the metallic tang of the betrayal. "It is indeed a special night, Julian. A night for settling all accounts." They sat down, the air thick with unsaid truths. Julian began to talk, a frantic, high-pitched monologue about market trends and future investments, his eyes darting repeatedly to Thomas's glass, waiting for the first sip. Thomas played the role of the aging, distracted father perfectly, nodding at the wrong times and fumbling with his napkin. "Oh, I think I heard the timer on the roast," Thomas said suddenly, half rising from his chair. As if on cue, a loud, jarring crash echoed from the kitchen. A heavy stack of trays Thomas had precariously balanced on the edge of the counter before Julian arrived. "What was that?" Julian asked, his head snapping toward the kitchen. In that split second of misdirection, a technique Thomas had taught to undercover recruits for decades, he swapped the glasses. The movement was fluid, silent, and invisible to the naked eye. When Julian turned back, Thomas was sitting calmly, his hand resting beside the now-safe glass. "Just the wind or a clumsy cat," Thomas said with a gentle smile. He picked up the glass and held it out. "Shall we? To family, Julian. To the truths that bind us." Julian's eyes gleamed with a predatory triumph. He clinked his glass against Thomas's and drank deeply, draining half the glass in a single, eager gulp. Thomas mimicked the motion, barely letting the liquid touch his lips. For a few minutes, the conversation continued. Julian's tone grew bolder, more arrogant. He leaned back, his hand tapping a rhythmic beat on the mahogany table. "You know, Dad, I've always admired your discipline. But the world belongs to the ones who know when to take what's theirs." Thomas leaned forward, his face illuminated by the candlelight, looking like the lead investigator once more. "Is that what you believe, Julian? That you can just take it?" Julian started to respond, but the words died in his throat. His tapping hand faltered. He tried to blink away a sudden cloudiness in his eyes. The room began to spin, the edges of the walls blurring into a dark, swirling vortex. "Dad, I feel strange," Julian whispered, his voice thick and slurred. He tried to reach for the table, but his muscles refused to obey. He slumped back into the chair, his body becoming a leaden weight he could no longer carry. Thomas didn't move to help him. He didn't call for a doctor. He simply sat there, watching the man he had called his son descend into the very darkness he had intended for his father. The hunter had become the prey, and the final act was about to begin. The silence in the dining room was absolute, save for the ragged, shallow breathing of the man slumped across the table. Julian's body had become a prisoner of his own making, a leaden weight anchored to the mahogany chair by the very toxin he had intended for Thomas. His eyes were wide, darting frantically around the room, filled with a primal terror as he realized he was conscious but completely paralyzed. Thomas Miller did not rush to his aid. He didn't scream for help or fumble for a phone. Instead, he stood up slowly, the stiff joints of a 75-year-old man providing a rhythmic creak that sounded like a ticking clock in the stillness. He walked to the head of the table, looking down at Julian with the cold, detached gaze of a lead investigator reviewing a closed file. "I found the fertility records in the attic, Julian," Thomas said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried no anger, only the crushing weight of a final verdict. "I know about the clinic Martha visited 30 years ago. I know that biologically, you are a stranger to me. I've known for a week." Julian tried to speak, but only a faint, wet wheeze escaped his throat. A single tear tracked through the sweat on his pale cheek. "But the blood wasn't the betrayal that broke me," Thomas continued, leaning in until he was inches from Julian's face. "It was the laptop. I installed a logger, Julian. I saw your searches. I saw the debt to the Macau syndicate. I saw the equation where you decided my life was a liability to be liquidated so you could pay for your failures." Thomas reached into his navy cardigan and produced a small digital recorder. He pressed a button, and the room was filled with the sound of Julian's own voice from earlier that evening, whispered into a hidden kitchen microphone as he had popped the cap on the vial. "Just a little more, and the house is finally mine. Sorry, old man, but time's up." The recording clicked off. Julian's pupils dilated in the candlelight, a silent scream trapped behind his teeth. "You were always a poor student of the game," Thomas murmured. "You thought you were the director, but you were just a character in a script I've spent 40 years perfecting. You didn't realize that a detective doesn't stop being a hunter just because he picks up a pair of pruning shears." Thomas didn't call an ambulance. Instead, he picked up the house phone and dialed a direct extension to the Major Crimes Unit. "Miller here. The suspect is incapacitated, secured, and ready for pickup at my residence. Bring the syndicate file and a medical team for a forensic tox screen." As the distant wail of sirens began to cut through the rain-soaked night, Thomas walked to the study. He opened the vintage safe Julian had coveted for so long. Inside, there were no gold bars or stacks of cash. There was only a single, worn wool blanket and a collection of old photographs of a boy riding a bike, a boy graduating from college, and a father who had loved him through every lie. When the officers arrived, Thomas's former colleagues, they found him standing on the porch, hands buried deep in his pockets, watching the red and blue lights dance across the roses. Julian was wheeled out on a stretcher, a disgraced banker stripped of his inheritance, his career, and his freedom. He would spend the rest of his life paying a debt that no amount of insurance money could ever settle. The investigators offered to stay, but Thomas declined with a polite, tired smile. "The ledger is balanced," he told them. "I'd like to get back to my garden now." By dawn, the rain had stopped. Thomas sat in his usual chair by the window, the worn wool blanket draped over his knees. The house was quiet again, but for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt clean. He looked out at the damp earth and the budding flowers, finally at peace. He knew that while the bloodline had been a lie, the justice he had served was the only truth that remained. The debts of the past were settled, and Thomas Miller was finally free to grow old on his own terms.